It was a chilly autumn morning, the kind that seemed to carry a certain weight in the air. Leaves, painted in shades of red, orange, and gold, tumbled across the empty road leading to the war memorial, their rustling the only sound in the stillness. The sun hadn't quite broken through the thick blanket of gray clouds, leaving the landscape bathed in a soft, muted light. The war memorial stood just outside a quiet, almost forgotten town. It wasn't grand or overly imposing, but its presence was undeniable. The granite wall rose like a solemn sentinel, its surface etched with the names of men and women who had given everything for their country. Each name told a story, a sacrifice, a loss, a life cut short. At the base of the wall, a small wreath lay, its bright red poppies a stark contrast against the cold stone. Jack Reynolds stood in front of the memorial, alone. He wasn't much to look at, a man in his late 50s, his face weathered and lined from years of hard living. His hair, once dark, was now streaked with silver, and a thick beard covered his jaw. He wore an old, faded green jacket, the kind that had seen better days, and a pair of scuffed work boots that had walked countless miles. His right leg was stiff, causing a slight limp as he moved. Jack's head was bowed, his hands resting lightly on a wooden cane. From a distance, he looked like any other passerby, maybe a retired factory worker or a man down on his luck. Most people wouldn't have given him a second glance. But if you stood close enough, you'd see something in his eyes, a depth, a quiet strength that hinted at a life far more complex than his humble appearance suggested. Jack came to this place often, though not many people noticed. The memorial was tucked away from the main road, visited only by those who remembered or cared. And Jack cared. He cared more than most. This wasn't just a place for him to reminisce. It wasn't a stop on a leisurely walk or a spot to kill time. For Jack, this was sacred ground. Each name on that wall meant something to him. He had known some of them, shared meals with them, laughed with them, fought alongside them. Others, he didn't know personally, but their stories had been passed down, their sacrifices etched into the collective memory of men like him. On this particular morning, the air was colder than usual, and Jack felt it deep in his bones. He shifted his weight, wincing slightly as his bad leg protested. He ignored the pain, his eyes fixed on a single name near the top of the wall. His lips moved, though no sound came out, as if he were speaking to someone only he could see. There was a heaviness to the moment, a silence so profound that it felt as though the world had paused to listen. The wind, gentle and steady, seemed to carry whispers, echoes of the past. Jack stood still, letting the memories wash over him. He had seen things, done things, that most people couldn't begin to imagine. And while he rarely spoke of those days, they were never far from his mind. As he stood there, lost in thought, a faint sound reached his ears. It was distant at first, barely noticeable, a low, rumbling noise that grew louder with each passing second. Jack's brow furrowed, his sharp instincts kicking in. He turned his head slightly, scanning the horizon. The sound grew closer, transforming into the unmistakable roar of motorcycles. Jack's jaw tightened. He recognized the sound immediately, not just the machines, but the energy behind them. This wasn't the casual hum of bikers out for a weekend ride. This was something else. The noise shattered the quiet reverence of the memorial, growing louder and more intrusive until it was impossible to ignore. Jack's grip on his cane tightened, his knuckles turning white. He stayed where he was, his posture straightening ever so slightly, though he still appeared calm. And then they came into view. A group of motorcycles, 5, maybe 6, appeared at the edge of the road, their riders clad in leather jackets and dark helmets. The gang rode with an air of arrogance, their engines revving unnecessarily loud as they approached. The lead rider, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek, slowed his bike as they neared the memorial. He raised a hand, signaling the others to stop. Jack didn't move. He stood rooted in place, his eyes narrowing as he watched the bikers dismount. They moved with an air of casual dominance, as if they owned the place. One of them lit a cigarette, flicking the match carelessly onto the grass. Another laughed loudly, his voice jarring against the quiet. The leader of the group strode toward the granite wall, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He stopped in front of the memorial, looking it over with a smirk that made Jack's stomach turn. "What do we have here?" the leader said, his voice loud and mocking. He turned to his companions. "A bunch of names on a rock. How cute." Jack's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. The bikers spread out, their voices breaking the stillness as they joked and laughed, their behavior growing more disrespectful with each passing moment. One of them leaned against the wall, his elbow resting carelessly over the etched names. Another tossed an empty soda can onto the ground near the wreath. Jack took a slow, deep breath. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had dealt with men like this before, loud, arrogant, and utterly unaware of the weight of their actions. The leader turned his attention to Jack, his smirk widening. "And who's this?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. "Grandpa here to give us a history lesson." The other bikers laughed, their voices echoing through the crisp morning air. Jack met the leader's gaze, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Jack broke the silence. "This is a place for respect," he said, his voice steady and calm. "You don't belong here." The leader raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Oh, is that so?" he said, taking a step closer. "And who's gonna stop us?" "You." Jack didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on the man in front of him. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something in the leader's eyes, uncertainty, perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. The leader chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that." He turned back to his gang, spreading his arms wide. "But this is our spot now. So why don't you hobble on outta here before you get hurt?" The laughter erupted again, but Jack didn't move. His grip on the cane tightened, his knuckles white. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. For Jack Reynolds wasn't just an old man with a limp. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was a veteran, a man who had faced down enemies far more dangerous than these bikers. And while they couldn't see it yet, they were about to learn that messing with him was the biggest mistake they'd ever make. But for now, Jack stood silent, his eyes fixed on the leader, his stance unwavering. The bikers may have thought they owned the moment, but Jack knew better. Patience, after all, was a skill he had mastered long ago. And he was waiting for the right time to remind them just what kind of man they were dealing with. Jack Reynolds didn't move a muscle as the leader of the gang continued to smirk at him, puffing his chest like a peacock. The man oozed arrogance, the kind of self-assuredness that came from never having faced real consequences. Jack knew the type all too well. He had seen their kind in bars, on city streets, and even in the heat of combat. Men who thought the world revolved around them until it didn't. The leader, clearly enjoying his little performance, leaned in slightly, his scar catching the faint sunlight. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue? Or are you too slow to keep up?" He snickered, his voice dripping with mockery. Behind him, the other bikers were watching closely. They didn't have the same confidence as their leader. One of them, a wiry man with a patchy beard, kept glancing between Jack and the memorial, as if unsure about the whole situation. Another, a younger guy with tattoos snaking up his neck, looked amused but less invested. The only one who seemed as brazen as the leader was a stocky brute cracking his knuckles loudly, clearly itching for trouble. Jack took his time, his face calm and unreadable. He let their laughter echo through the air for a moment longer before he finally spoke again. "This memorial isn't just some stone wall," he said, his voice low but firm. It's a place to honor the men and women who gave their lives for something bigger than themselves. Something you clearly wouldn't understand. The laughter died down. The leader straightened, his smirk fading just slightly. Is that right? He said, his tone sharper now. And what do you know about sacrifice, huh? You think you're better than us because you're standing here in your old man boots, acting all high and mighty. Jack didn't answer right away. He shifted his weight onto his cane, the movement deliberate. Then he lifted his gaze, locking eyes with the leader. His stare was steady, unflinching, and colder than the autumn wind. What I know, Jack said slowly, is that men like you don't know the first thing about respect. You think you can walk into a place like this and do whatever you want because no one's ever stopped you before. But I'm not no one. There was a pause. The bikers exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier bravado wavering. But the leader wasn't ready to back down. If anything, Jack's calm demeanor only seemed to irritate him more. You've got a big mouth for someone who can barely stand up straight, the leader said, taking another step forward. He towered over Jack now, close enough to smell the cigarette smoke clinging to his jacket. Maybe it's time someone taught you how to keep it shut. Jack tilted his head slightly, his lips twitching into the faintest hint of a smile. You're welcome to try, he said evenly. The leader blinked, caught off guard by the response. The other bikers fell silent, their eyes darting between Jack and their leader. Even the stocky brute, who had been so eager for a fight, seemed less sure now. There was something about the way Jack carried himself, something unshakable, like the man was carved from the same granite as the memorial behind him. The leader laughed, but it was forced, lacking the confidence from before. You're a stubborn old man, I'll give you that, he said, stepping back. But don't think for a second that you can scare us. This place? It doesn't mean a thing to me. It's just a bunch of rocks and dead names. Jack's expression darkened. For the first time, a flicker of anger passed across his face, but it was controlled, measured. Those names, he said quietly, belong to heroes. Men and women who gave their lives so you could stand here today, running your mouth without a care in the world. You don't have to respect me, but you will respect them. The leader opened his mouth to respond, but Jack didn't give him the chance. He took a single step forward, his limp barely noticeable now. Though Jack was shorter and thinner than the gang leader, his presence seemed to grow, filling the space between them. Do you know what it's like to watch a man die in your arms? Jack asked, his voice steady but laced with steel. Do you know what it feels like to carry the weight of his last words? To see the life leave his eyes and know there's nothing you can do to bring him back. The leader faltered, his smirk slipping. He glanced over his shoulder at his gang, but none of them dared to speak. The bravado that had filled the air just moments before was gone, replaced by an uneasy silence. Jack's gaze never wavered. I've carried that weight for 40 years, he said, his voice dropping even lower. And I come here to honor the men who didn't make it home, the ones who gave everything so the rest of us could live in peace. And now, I see punks like you, who take that peace for granted. Who think the world owes them something. You don't even realize how lucky you are. The leader swallowed hard, his confidence draining away under Jack's relentless stare. For the first time, he seemed to understand that he wasn't in control of the situation anymore. One of the younger bikers, the one with the tattoos, shifted uncomfortably. Hey, maybe we should just go, he muttered, his voice barely audible. The leader hesitated, his pride clearly at war with his growing unease. He turned back to Jack, his jaw tightening. This isn't over, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We'll be back. Jack didn't blink. You'd better think twice about that, he said simply. The leader glared at him for a moment longer before motioning to his gang. Let's go, he barked, his frustration evident. The bikers climbed onto their motorcycles, the roar of the engines breaking the silence once more. As they sped away, Jack stood motionless, watching them until they disappeared from sight. Only then did he let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He turned back to the memorial, his gaze softening as it fell on the names etched into the stone. "I won't let them disrespect you," he murmured quietly. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around him. Jack adjusted his grip on his cane and took a step closer to the wall. He traced a name with his fingers, his touch gentle and reverent. "Not on my watch." The tension in the air lingered, even after the bikers were gone. Jack knew this wasn't the end of it. Men like that didn't back down easily. They'd be back, and next time, they'd bring trouble. But Jack wasn't worried. He had faced worse. Much worse. And he wasn't about to let a group of disrespectful punks desecrate the memory of those who had sacrificed everything. As he stood there, the faint hum of another engine reached his ears. But this one wasn't loud or aggressive. It was softer, calmer, a single car pulling into the small gravel lot near the memorial. Jack turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he watched the vehicle approach. The car came to a stop, and the door opened. A woman stepped out, her expression one of quiet concern. "Jack," she called, her voice carrying over the wind. Jack straightened, his expression softening slightly. "Morning, Claire," he said, his voice calm but tired. Claire was the town's mayor, a kind-hearted woman in her early 40s who had always respected Jack and his connection to the memorial. She had come by before, usually to check on him or to leave flowers for her grandfather, whose name was etched on the wall. But today, there was something different in her demeanor. She looked worried, her eyes darting toward the road where the bikers had disappeared. "I saw them," she said, her tone anxious. "Are you okay?" Jack nodded. "I'm fine," he said simply. Claire hesitated, her brow furrowing. "They looked rough," she said. "Are you sure they're not going to come back?" Jack glanced at the memorial, his expression unreadable. "Oh, they'll be back," he said quietly. "But I'll be ready." Claire frowned, her concern deepening. "Jack, maybe we should call the police." "No," Jack interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "This isn't something they can handle." Claire opened her mouth to argue, but the look in Jack's eyes stopped her. There was a resolve there, a quiet determination that left no room for debate. "All right," she said reluctantly. "But promise me you'll be careful." Jack gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Always." As Claire returned to her car, Jack turned back to the memorial, his mind already focused on what was to come. The bikers thought they could scare him, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. And when they returned, Jack would be ready to show them exactly why this place and the names it honored was worth fighting for. The gang's laughter was sharp and grating, cutting through the quiet reverence of the war memorial. Jack stood still, his steady gaze fixed on the leader, who now leaned against the granite wall as if it were just another prop for his arrogance. "This isn't a place for games," the leader mocked, mimicking Jack's even tone. "Well, old man, maybe it's time someone shook this place up. It's too quiet around here." The others in the gang chuckled and hollered in agreement, their voices crude and disrespectful. One of them, a wiry man with a wild beard, pulled a bottle of beer from his saddlebag and took a long swig before smashing the empty glass against the base of the memorial. Shards of glass scattered across the stone, glinting in the sunlight. Jack's jaw tightened. His hand gripped the head of his cane a little firmer, but he didn't move. His expression remained unreadable, calm even, though inside, a quiet anger simmered. The leader's smirk widened as he noticed Jack's stillness. "What's the matter? You gonna call the cops on us? Or maybe you're just too scared to do anything about it?" "I'm not scared," Jack said quietly, his voice cutting through the gang's jeers like a blade. "But you should be. That simple statement caused a ripple in the gang's bravado. The leader's smirk faltered for just a second, but he quickly covered it with a laugh. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward. His limp was barely noticeable now, his movements measured but purposeful. His gaze swept over the gang, taking them in one by one. He saw their arrogance, their bravado, but he also saw something else. Uncertainty. Beneath all the noise and swagger, they weren't as confident as they pretended to be. The leader stepped forward to meet Jack, his towering frame meant to intimidate. He loomed over the older man, his leather jacket creaking as he crossed his arms. "Listen, old-timer, why don't you do yourself a favor and walk away before you get hurt?" Jack tilted his head slightly, his lips twitching into the faintest hint of a smile. "I've been hurt worse than you can imagine," he said evenly. "And I'm still standing." The gang fell silent, their laughter and jeers drying up in the face of Jack's calm defiance. The leader, caught off guard by the unexpected response, glanced at his crew as if seeking reassurance. One of them, a stocky man with a shaved head, muttered, "What's with this guy? He's not scared of us." The leader snapped his fingers, regaining control of the moment. "Enough of this," he barked. He turned back to Jack, his expression hardening. "You think you're some kind of tough guy, huh? Well, let's see how tough you are when we're done here." He motioned to one of his men, who grinned wickedly and pulled out a knife. The blade glinted in the sunlight as he approached the memorial, his intentions clear. He wasn't just planning to vandalize the wall, he wanted to desecrate it. Jack's eyes narrowed. He stepped in front of the man, blocking his path. "Put it away," he said, his voice calm but firm. The man hesitated, caught off guard by Jack's unwavering stance. But the leader wasn't about to let his authority be questioned. "Do it," he ordered, his voice sharp. The man raised the knife, but before he could take another step, Jack moved. It wasn't a big movement, just a subtle shift in his stance, but it was enough to catch the man off balance. In an instant, Jack's cane was in motion, its heavy wooden head striking the knife from the man's hand with a sharp crack. The weapon clattered to the ground, and the man yelped in pain, clutching his wrist. The gang stared, stunned into silence. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Jack lowered his cane, his expression calm once more. "This memorial isn't just a piece of stone," he said, his voice steady. "It's a reminder of what real courage looks like. Men and women gave their lives for this country, for people like you, whether you deserve it or not. And I won't let you desecrate their memory." The leader's face twisted with anger. "You think you can just walk over us like that?" he snarled. "You've got no idea who you're messing with, old man." "And you've got no idea who you're messing with," Jack replied, his tone as steady as ever. The leader let out a furious growl and lunged at Jack, but the older man was ready. Despite his limp, Jack moved with precision, sidestepping the attack and bringing his cane down hard against the man's leg. The leader stumbled, cursing as he tried to regain his footing. The rest of the gang hesitated, unsure whether to jump in. They had expected an easy target, a quiet old man who wouldn't put up a fight. But Jack wasn't what they had expected. There was something about the way he moved, the way he carried himself. It was clear he'd seen more battles than they could imagine. The leader straightened, his face red with anger and humiliation. "You think you're some kind of hero," he spat. "You're nothing but an old cripple." Jack's expression didn't change. "I've been called worse," he said. The leader glared at him, breathing heavily. "This isn't over," he said, motioning to his crew. "Let's go. But we'll be back, old man. You can count on that." The gang mounted their bikes, their engines roaring to life. One by one, they sped off, their threats hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Jack watched them go, his expression unreadable. He didn't doubt they would return, and he knew they'd bring more trouble with them. But he wasn't afraid. As the sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance, Jack turned back to the memorial. He bent down slowly, picking up the broken shards of glass from the ground. His movements were careful, almost reverent, as if he were tending to the grave of an old friend. When the grass was clear, he straightened and placed a hand on the granite wall. His fingers traced the names etched into the stone, each one a reminder of the lives lost, the sacrifices made. "They don't understand," he murmured quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. "But they will." The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. Jack stood there for a long time, his mind already turning to what he would do next. The gang had made their intentions clear, and Jack knew they wouldn't stop until they had their way. But Jack wasn't a man who gave up easily. He had fought battles before, battles far more dangerous than this. And he wasn't about to let a group of thugs destroy the peace and respect that this place represented. He glanced at the road where the bikers had disappeared, his expression hardening. "If they want a fight," he said quietly, "they'll get one." With that, Jack turned and walked back to his truck. His limp was more pronounced now, but he didn't let it slow him down. He had work to do. As he climbed into the driver's seat, he cast one last look at the memorial. The names etched in stone seemed to gleam in the fading sunlight, as if offering him their silent support. Jack started the engine and drove away, the rumble of his truck fading into the distance. The memorial stood silent once more, a beacon of courage and sacrifice. But Jack knew that silence wouldn't last long. The gang would return, and when they did, he would be ready. The bikers didn't take long to make good on their threat. Jack had expected them to return within a few days, but it was barely 24 hours later when the familiar roar of engines shattered the quiet serenity of the town once again. This time, the sound was louder, angrier, and unmistakably purposeful. Jack had spent the day at his small farmhouse on the outskirts of town, preparing for their return. The old house wasn't much to look at, peeling paint, creaky floors, but it was sturdy, like its owner. Inside, Jack had laid out a few items from a locked chest he hadn't touched in years. Dog tags, a faded photograph of his unit, and a knife with a blade worn from use were scattered across the table. His hand lingered on the photograph. The faces of his old comrades stared back at him, young and full of fire. Jack's throat tightened. "You boys always had my back," he murmured. "Guess it's my turn now." The sound of engines growing closer snapped Jack out of his thoughts. He stood, his movements slow but deliberate. He wasn't a man to rush. Rushing got you killed. He walked to the front door, leaning slightly on his cane, and opened it just in time to see the gang's motorcycles pulling into his dirt driveway. There were more of them this time, at least a dozen, maybe more. The leader, the one with the scar, dismounted first. His face was twisted into a smug grin as he surveyed the property. "Nice place you got here," the leader called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "A little rundown, but I guess it suits you." Jack stepped onto the porch, his cane tapping against the wooden boards. "Didn't think you'd be back so soon," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Figured you'd need more time to lick your wounds." The gang erupted into laughter, though it was forced and uneasy. The leader's grin faltered, but he quickly recovered. "You've got a smart mouth for an old man," he said. "But that's not why we're here. We're here to make sure you understand who's in charge now." Jack didn't respond immediately. He let the leader's words hang in the air, his sharp gaze sweeping over the group. He could see their nervous energy, the way some of them shifted their weight or glanced at each other. They weren't as tough as they wanted to appear. "Let me save you the trouble," Jack said finally, his voice cutting through the tension. "You're not in charge. Not here. Not now. Not ever." The leader's face darkened. He took a step forward, pointing a finger at Jack. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with, old man. We run this town now. You're just a relic, standing in the way of progress." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Progress? Is that what you call smashing beer bottles and threatening veterans? Sounds more like cowardice to me." The leader's hand clenched into a fist, and for a moment, it looked like he might charge up the porch steps. But he held back, glancing at his crew. "Teach him a lesson," he barked. Two of the gang members stepped forward, their faces twisted into sneers. One was the wiry man who'd smashed the beer bottle at the memorial, and the other was a stocky brute with tattoos snaking up his arms. They climbed the porch steps, clearly expecting Jack to back down. But Jack didn't move. The wiry man was the first to reach him, his hand darting out to grab Jack's collar. Before he could make contact, Jack's cane moved in a blur. The heavy wooden shaft struck the man's wrist with a crack, and he howled in pain, stumbling back. The stocky brute lunged next, but Jack was ready. He stepped to the side, using his cane to sweep the man's legs out from under him. The brute hit the porch with a thud, groaning as he clutched his side. The gang stared in stunned silence. "Anyone else?" Jack asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. The leader's face twisted in anger. "You think you're some kind of hero," he spat. "You're just a broken-down old man who doesn't know when to quit." Jack's eyes narrowed. "I know exactly when to quit," he said. "It's when the fight's over. And this fight? It hasn't even started." The leader let out a roar of frustration. "Get him," he shouted, and the rest of the gang surged forward. Jack moved with the precision of a man who had faced danger before. He didn't rely on brute strength, he didn't have to. Instead, he used his knowledge, his experience, and the environment around him. The porch railings became shields, the steps became obstacles. One by one, the gang members fell back, their attacks thwarted by Jack's quick thinking and precise movements. It wasn't long before the dirt driveway was littered with groaning men, clutching their injuries and glaring up at Jack with a mix of anger and fear. The leader was the last one standing. His face was a mask of rage as he stepped forward, pulling a knife from his belt. "You think you've won," he snarled. "I'll show you what happens when you mess with me." Jack's expression didn't waver. He stood his ground, his cane at the ready. "You've already lost," he said quietly. The leader lunged, his knife flashing in the sunlight. But Jack was faster. He sidestepped the attack, bringing his cane down hard on the leader's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground, and the leader stumbled, clutching his hand in pain. Jack didn't give him a chance to recover. He swept the leader's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. The gang leader lay there, gasping for breath, his face twisted in humiliation. Jack leaned on his cane, looking down at the defeated man. "You're done here," he said. "You and your boys. Don't come back." The leader glared up at him, but there was no fight left in his eyes. He scrambled to his feet, motioning for the rest of the gang to follow. One by one, they climbed onto their bikes, their faces sullen and defeated. As they roared away, Jack stood on the porch, watching until the sound of their engines faded into the distance. For a moment, the world was silent again. Jack took a deep breath, his grip on the cane relaxing. He turned and walked back inside, closing the door behind him. But he knew this wasn't the end. The gang might have been beaten today, but they weren't the type to let a loss go unanswered. Jack wasn't worried, though. He had faced tougher battles before, and he wasn't about to back down now. As he sat down at the kitchen table, his eyes fell on the photograph of his unit. He picked it up, running a finger over the faces of his old comrades. "Guess I'll be needing your help again, boys," he murmured. The wind howled outside, carrying the promise of another fight to come. And Jack was ready for it. The bikers exchanged glances, a mixture of smug amusement and faint unease rippling through the group. Jack wasn't yelling or posturing, he didn't need to. His quiet intensity had a way of filling the space, making even the boldest among them hesitate for a split second. "Leave," the leader repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. He turned to his crew. "Hear that, boys? Grandpa wants us to leave. Like he owns the place." The group burst into laughter, the sound echoing through the solemn air of the memorial grounds. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo curling around his neck, stepped forward, emboldened by the leader's bravado. He jabbed a finger in Jack's direction. "Listen, old man," he sneered, "why don't you shuffle back to whatever hole you crawled out of? This here's public property, and we're just enjoying the view." Jack didn't flinch. His sharp gaze moved from the wiry biker to the leader, then to the others. Each man avoided his eyes, as if afraid of what they might see there. "This isn't just public property," Jack said evenly, his voice cutting through their jeers like a blade. "It's a place to honor the fallen. Men and women who gave their lives so people like you could have the freedom to stand here. But that freedom doesn't give you the right to disrespect their memory." For a moment, a hush fell over the group. Some of the bikers shifted uncomfortably, their bravado cracking under the weight of Jack's words. But the leader wasn't about to back down, not in front of his crew. "Spare me the lecture, Grandpa," he said, stepping closer to Jack. His voice was cold, his smile venomous. "Those names on the wall? They're just that, names. The dead don't care what we do. And neither do I." Jack's hand tightened around his cane, but he kept his posture relaxed. His silence seemed to unnerve the leader, who jabbed a thumb at the memorial. "Tell you what," the leader said with a smirk, "why don't you take a picture of this precious little monument? That way, when it's gone, you'll have something to remember it by." "Gone?" Jack's stomach churned at the implication. He took another step forward, his voice low but firm. "What are you planning to do?" The leader's grin widened. "Oh, you'll see," he said. "Let's just say we've got big plans for this place. Real big. So why don't you take your cane and hobble on out of here before things get messy?" Jack's expression didn't change, but inside, a fire was building. These men weren't just disrespectful, they were dangerous. And their presence at the memorial wasn't random. They were here for a reason, and Jack intended to find out what it was. As the gang continued their antics, Jack's mind raced. He wasn't a man who jumped to conclusions, but his years in the service had taught him to trust his instincts. Something about the leader's tone, the way the others followed his lead without question, told Jack this wasn't just a group of troublemakers out for a joyride. They had a purpose, and it wasn't good. He took a step back, not out of fear, but to observe. From this distance, he could see the subtle hierarchy within the gang. The leader, of course, was the one in charge, but there were others, lieutenants, so to speak, who seemed to hold sway over the group. The wiry man with the snake tattoo, for instance, acted as an enforcer, egging on the others and keeping them in line. Jack also noticed their bikes. Each one was customized, not just for show but for speed and durability. These weren't hobbyists, they were professionals, or at least experienced riders who had invested heavily in their machines. Jack's eyes lingered on the patches sewn onto their leather jackets. Most were standard insignias, flames, skulls, and other cliched designs, but one caught his attention, a jagged red lightning bolt stitched above a black fist. He'd seen that symbol before. Years ago, in a different part of the world, a group of mercenaries had used the same insignia. They weren't soldiers, not officially, but they operated in the shadows, taking on jobs too dirty for anyone else. Jack couldn't say for certain that these bikers were connected, but the coincidence was too striking to ignore. As Jack pieced these details together, the leader turned back to him, his smile fading. "What's the matter, Grandpa?" he sneered. "Cat got your tongue?" Jack straightened, his hand brushing against the metal pin to his jacket. "You boys think you're tough," he said, his voice calm but razor sharp. "But you have no idea what real toughness looks like." The leader's eyes narrowed. "Oh yeah," he said, stepping closer. "And what would you know about it?" Jack met his gaze, unflinching. "I know more than you ever will," he said. "And if you've got any sense, you'll leave this place and never come back." The leader barked out a laugh, but it sounded hollow. He turned to his crew. "You hear that, boys? Grandpa thinks he can scare us off with a little tough talk. Hate to break it to you, old man, but your time is long gone. This is our world now." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. The way he carried himself, the quiet confidence in his stance, said more than words ever could. For a moment, the leader seemed to waver. But then he shook his head, as if shaking off a spell. He jabbed a finger at Jack, his voice rising. "You've got until tomorrow to clear out of here," he said. "After that, this place is ours. And if you're still around," he let the threat hang in the air, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Jack didn't flinch. "We'll see," he said simply. The gang laughed again, their mockery echoing through the memorial grounds as they mounted their bikes. Engines roared to life, and one by one, they sped off, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the faint smell of exhaust. Jack watched them go, his expression unreadable. When the last bike disappeared over the hill, he turned back to the memorial. He ran his fingers over the etched names, his touch reverent. "I won't let them take this place," he said softly, his voice firm. "Not while I'm still breathing." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the memorial, Jack stood alone, the weight of the past pressing heavily on his shoulders. He knew the fight was far from over. But he also knew he wasn't fighting for himself, he was fighting for those who could no longer fight for themselves. And Jack Reynolds wasn't a man who gave up easily. As the echoes of the biker engines faded into the distance, Jack stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The wind carried a chill, but he hardly noticed. His thoughts churned like a storm, memories of battles fought and comrades lost blending with the present. This wasn't just a gang of rowdy men causing trouble, it was something far more deliberate, far more dangerous. Jack knelt down, his hand brushing over the base of the memorial where the gang leader had carved his crude graffiti. The disrespect hit Jack harder than he let on. These weren't just names, they were pieces of history, sacrifices made by men and women who had given everything. Each letter etched into the stone represented a story, a family, a legacy. And now, that legacy was being trampled on by men who knew nothing of honor. Jack took a deep breath and stood, his cane steadying him. He wouldn't let anger cloud his judgment. Instead, he focused on the facts. The gang wasn't here by accident. Their leader's veiled threat about big plans wasn't idle chatter. Jack's instincts, honed over years of service, told him there was a bigger picture he hadn't yet seen. And he needed to see it. Jack limped toward his truck parked at the edge of the memorial grounds. The vehicle was as unassuming as he was, an old but reliable pickup that had seen better days. Inside, tucked beneath the driver's seat, was a small notebook. Jack pulled it out, flipping through its worn pages until he found what he was looking for, a list of contacts. It had been years since he'd called any of them, but Jack knew these were the kind of people who'd answer. The kind of people who understood the importance of this memorial and what it stood for. He tapped his finger on a name and pulled out his phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in nearly a decade. Reynolds. The voice on the other end was gravelly but unmistakable. "It's me, Tommy," Jack said, leaning against the side of his truck. "I need your help." By the time Jack hung up the phone, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Tommy had promised to reach out to some old friends who might have insight into the gang's activities. In the meantime, Jack decided to do a little digging of his own. The next morning, Jack drove into town, his limp more pronounced than usual after the long night. He parked outside the local diner, a hub of gossip and information. As he stepped inside, the warm smell of coffee and bacon greeted him, along with a few familiar faces. "Jack Reynolds," said Doris, the diner's owner, as she approached with the coffee pot in hand. "Haven't seen you around here in a while." "Busy morning, Doris," Jack replied, sliding into a booth. "Got a question for you." Doris raised an eyebrow, pouring him a cup of coffee. "You're not usually one for questions." Jack nodded toward a table in the corner, where a couple of younger men were talking in hushed tones. "Those boys ever cause any trouble?" Doris followed his gaze, her expression tightening. "They've been hanging around lately." "Don't think they're from here." "Why?" Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a sip of his coffee, his eyes scanning the room. The two men didn't seem to notice him, or if they did, they were good at pretending. Jack recognized the subtle signs, restless movements, quick glances toward the door. They weren't locals, and they weren't here for the scenery. "Just curious," Jack said finally, setting his cup down. "If you hear anything about them or anyone else, let me know." Doris hesitated, then nodded. "I'll keep my ears open." "Be careful, Jack." Later that afternoon, Tommy called back with news. The gang wasn't just a group of rowdy bikers, they were part of a larger network involved in illegal activities across the state. Their leader, known only as Scar, had a reputation for using violence to get what he wanted. And what he wanted now, it seemed, was control over the land surrounding the memorial. "Why a war memorial?" Jack asked, his grip tightening on the phone. "Could be anything," Tommy replied. "Drugs, weapons, money laundering. They don't care about the memorial itself, it's just in the way." Jack's jaw clenched. The thought of these men exploiting sacred ground for their schemes filled him with quiet fury. But Tommy's warning was clear: this wasn't a fight Jack could take on alone. "You sure you're up for this?" Tommy asked after a pause. Jack's voice was steady. "I've faced worse." Jack spent the next few days preparing. He revisited the memorial daily, his presence a silent declaration that he wasn't going anywhere. The bikers didn't return yet, but Jack knew it was only a matter of time. He also started gathering supplies. A trip to the hardware store provided him with what he needed: a few tools, some rope, and other odds and ends that might come in handy. The clerk gave him a curious look, but Jack just smiled and paid in cash. At night, Jack reviewed the information Tommy had sent him. Maps, photos, and notes about the gang's movements painted a clearer picture of what he was up against. Scar wasn't just a bully, he was calculated, dangerous, and well-connected. But Jack had faced men like him before, and he wasn't about to back down now. The confrontation Jack had been waiting for finally came late one afternoon. He was standing near the memorial, his hands resting on his cane, when he heard the familiar roar of engines. The gang appeared on the horizon, their formation tight and menacing. Scar dismounted first, his smirk as arrogant as ever. The rest of the gang followed suit, spreading out in a semicircle around Jack. "Still here, Grandpa?" Scar said, lighting a cigarette. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" Jack didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a step forward, his eyes locking with Scar's. "This memorial isn't yours to take." Scar exhaled a plume of smoke, his grin widening. "Oh, I think you'll find it is. See, I've got plans for this place." "And you?" He flicked the cigarette onto the ground. "You're just in the way." Jack's gaze didn't waver. "You can try to take it," he said, his voice low and steady. "But you'll regret it." The tension in the air was palpable. For a moment, no one moved. Then Scar laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. But guts won't save you. As the gang mounted their bikes and sped away, Jack stood his ground, his resolve unshaken. The battle was far from over, but Jack knew one thing for certain: he wasn't fighting this fight alone. The air around the war memorial seemed to crackle with tension. Jack stood tall, his posture unwavering, as the gang faltered in their confidence. His quiet strength was a force they hadn't anticipated, and now, with their leader staring him down, the balance of power was shifting. Scar recovered first, masking his unease with a derisive snort. "A patch and a medal don't scare me, old man," he said, spitting on the ground for emphasis. "You might have been something once, but now you're just a cripple standing in our way." Jack's eyes narrowed, his calm demeanor unbroken. "You're right," he said. "I've got a limp. I've got scars. But you don't survive what I've been through without learning a thing or two. You've got numbers, but numbers mean nothing when you don't know what you're up against." Scar wasn't one to back down. He motioned to two of his men, both of whom stepped forward with smug confidence. The first biker, a burly man with tattooed arms, lunged at Jack, throwing a wild punch. Jack sidestepped with practiced ease, using his cane to trip the man and send him sprawling to the ground. The second biker hesitated for a split second, but that was all Jack needed. He grabbed the man's arm, twisted it behind his back, and forced him to the ground with a swift, calculated motion. The gang stared, stunned. Their usual tactics, intimidation, brute force, weren't working. Jack was no ordinary opponent. He moved with precision, each action deliberate and efficient. Scar's smirk vanished. "Get him," he barked, his voice rising in anger. The remaining bikers charged, their confidence bolstered by their leader's command. But Jack was ready. His movements were fluid, his cane and his bare hands his only weapons. One by one, the bikers fell. A swift jab to the ribs, a disarming twist, a perfectly timed shove, all executed with a level of skill that left no room for doubt. But Jack wasn't just fighting them off, he was teaching them a lesson. "You think you can take what doesn't belong to you," he said, his voice steady even as he dodged another attack. "You think you can dishonor the names on this wall and walk away unscathed? Not on my watch." Scar watched in disbelief as his men struggled to gain the upper hand. Jack's age and limp had fooled them all, but now, his true nature was impossible to ignore. He wasn't just a veteran, he was a warrior. The fight was nearing its climax. Only Scar and a couple of his men remained standing. Jack's breathing was heavy, but his resolve was unshaken. He turned his attention to Scar, who was gripping a chain he'd pulled from his bike. The leader swung it menacingly, his face a mask of fury. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Scar growled, advancing on Jack. "You're just an old fool clinging to the past." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he adjusted his stance, his grip on the cane tightening. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "This memorial stands for something bigger than you or me. It's a reminder of sacrifice, of honor. And I'll be damned if I let you defile it." Scar roared in anger, swinging the chain toward Jack. But Jack was faster. He deflected the blow with his cane, using the momentum to knock the chain out of Scar's hand. Before Scar could react, Jack delivered a precise strike to his knee, forcing him to the ground. The leader knelt, clutching his leg, his bravado shattered. Jack stood over him, his expression unreadable. "You don't deserve to stand here," he said quietly. "Now get out, and take your men with you." Scar's men, beaten and shaken, hesitated. They looked to their leader, who was now glaring up at Jack with a mixture of rage and fear. "You think this is over?" Scar spat. "You think you've won?" Jack knelt down, his eyes level with Scar's. "This isn't about winning," he said. "It's about respect, something you clearly don't understand." But let me make one thing clear. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was worn and creased, as if it had been carried for years. Jack unfolded it, revealing a photograph of a young soldier standing beside a helicopter. "This was me," Jack said, holding the photo up for Scar to see. "In a place where men like you wouldn't last a day. I fought for this country, for the freedom you take for granted. And I've lost more than you'll ever know." The gang was silent, their eyes fixed on the photograph. For the first time, they seemed to grasp the weight of what Jack was saying. "You think you're tough," Jack continued, his voice steady. "But you don't know the first thing about real strength. Real strength is standing for something that matters. Real strength is sacrifice." Scar didn't respond. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by a grimace of pain and humiliation. He struggled to his feet, glaring at Jack with barely contained rage. But he didn't attack again. He knew he couldn't win. "Let's go," Scar growled to his men. The bikers hesitated, glancing at Jack one last time before retreating to their bikes. Engines roared to life, and one by one, they sped away, leaving the memorial and Jack untouched. As the sound of the motorcycles faded, Jack turned back to the memorial. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the granite wall. He ran his fingers over the names etched into the stone, his expression softening. "I promised I'd protect you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "And I always will." Jack picked up his cane and started walking back to his truck. The fight was over, but the memory of it would linger not just for him, but for the gang who had learned a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. And as the memorial stood in solemn silence, it seemed to echo Jack's unspoken vow, to honor the past, protect the present, and stand firm against those who would threaten either. Jack lingered by the memorial for a moment longer, his breathing slowing as the adrenaline ebbed from his veins. The bikers were gone, but their presence, their disrespect, still hung in the air like a foul stench. Jack's gaze swept over the damage they had left behind. Scuff marks on the stone. A smear of grease on the base. And worst of all, the crude scratchings carved into the sacred granite. His jaw clenched. The names on this wall weren't just names to him, they were comrades, brothers, and sisters in arms who had given everything. Each letter etched into the stone carried the weight of a story, a sacrifice. For those names to be treated like this? It wasn't just disrespect. It was an insult to everything Jack had fought for, everything they had died for. Jack knelt down, his bad knee protesting the movement, and pulled a handkerchief from his pocket. Slowly, methodically, he began wiping away the grease smears. Each stroke of the cloth felt like an act of defiance, a small but meaningful way to restore dignity to the memorial. As he worked, a memory surfaced, unbidden. It was of a mission long ago, deep in enemy territory. His unit had been outnumbered and surrounded, and Jack, the youngest among them, had thought they were done for. But their captain, a man whose name was now etched on this very wall, had refused to give up. "Rebuild from what you've got," the captain had said, even as the enemy bore down on them. "It's not about what's lost. It's about what you can still protect." Those words had carried Jack through that mission, through the rest of the war, and through every challenge life had thrown at him since. Now, as he scrubbed at the grime left by those bikers, the words rang truer than ever. The sound of footsteps broke Jack's reverie. He looked up to see a young woman approaching cautiously. She looked to be in her late 20s, with a camera slung around her neck and a notepad in hand. Her expression was a mix of concern and curiosity. "I saw what happened," she said softly, stopping a few feet away. "Are you okay?" Jack straightened slowly, using his cane for support. "I'm fine," he said gruffly. "The memorial's not, though." The woman nodded, her eyes drifting to the marks on the granite. "I'm Sarah," she said. "I'm a reporter for the local paper." I was driving by when I saw the bikers, and then I saw you. Jack's brow furrowed. He wasn't a fan of reporters, but he could see the sincerity in her eyes. She wasn't here for a sensational headline, she was here because she cared. They didn't seem to know who they were dealing with, Sarah added, a small, wry smile tugging at her lips. Jack gave a short, humorless chuckle. No, they didn't. Sarah hesitated before speaking again. The way you handled them, it was impressive. But it wasn't just about stopping them, was it? This place means something to you. Jack looked back at the memorial, his expression softening. It means everything, he said simply. These names, they're my friends. My family. They're the ones who didn't make it back. Sarah swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. You served with them. Jack nodded, his fingers brushing against the metal pin to his jacket. Special Forces. Vietnam. I was just a kid when I signed up, but by the time I came home, he trailed off, the unspoken weight of his words filling the silence. Sarah glanced at her notepad, then back at Jack. Would you mind if I told your story? People should know what you did here today. What you've done for this country. Jack considered her offer for a long moment. He wasn't one for recognition, but maybe just maybe sharing his story would remind others of the importance of this memorial. Of the sacrifices it represented. All right, he said finally. But this isn't about me. It's about them. He gestured to the wall. Make sure people remember that. Over the next few days, Sarah's article spread quickly. Titled The Guardian of Granite, it told the story of Jack's confrontation with the bikers, but more importantly, it highlighted the significance of the war memorial and the sacrifices it honored. The piece struck a chord with the community, sparking a wave of support. Volunteers showed up at the memorial, bringing cleaning supplies and flowers. Veterans from nearby towns came to pay their respects, sharing their own stories of service and loss. Even local businesses pitched in, donating funds to repair the damage and install security cameras to prevent future vandalism. Jack watched it all from a distance, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. He hadn't sought attention or gratitude, but seeing the community rally around the memorial reminded him that the values he had fought for, respect, unity, honor, still mattered. They still lived on in the hearts of those who cared. One afternoon, as Jack was tending to the newly restored memorial, a rumble of engines broke the peaceful silence. His hand tightened on his cane as he turned to face the source of the noise. But this time, it wasn't the gang. 3 of the bikers from that day minus their leader approached on foot, their helmets in hand and their expressions subdued. Jack's eyes narrowed, his guard instantly up. We're not here to cause trouble, one of them said quickly. He was younger than Jack had remembered, his face pale and nervous. We wanted to apologize. Jack said nothing, his silence heavy and deliberate. The biker shifted uncomfortably. What we did was wrong. Disrespectful. We didn't understand, we didn't know what this place meant. But after we left that day, we couldn't stop thinking about it. About you. Another biker, older and rougher looking, stepped forward. Scar, our leader, he's not one to back down. But the rest of us? We've got families, friends, we get it now. And we're sorry. Jack studied them for a long moment, searching their faces for any sign of insincerity. Finally, he nodded. Respect isn't about words, he said. It's about actions. If you're serious, show it. The younger biker nodded eagerly. We will. We promise. Over the weeks that followed, Jack noticed the bikers keeping their word. They returned to the memorial several times, not as vandals, but as volunteers. They helped with maintenance, brought flowers, and even stood silently in reflection alongside the veterans who visited. It wasn't an easy road, but Jack believed in second chances. And as he watched them work, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had learned something that day. And as the seasons turned and the memorial stood firm against time and weather, Jack remained its quiet guardian. A man who had fought for his country, his comrades, and the memory of those who had given their all. A man who, against all odds, had shown that one voice, one stand, could make a difference. For Jack, the fight wasn't over. But it wasn't about battles anymore. It was about protecting what mattered and ensuring that the names on that wall were never forgotten. The gang's roar faded into the distance, leaving the air heavy with tension but filled with a restored calm. Jack stood there for a moment, the quiet of the war memorial wrapping around him like a protective shield. His hand lingered over one name etched into the granite, a name that once belonged to his best friend, his brother in arms. Jack whispered softly, almost as if the name itself could hear him. "I promised you I'd protect this place, no matter what." The damage wasn't severe, but to Jack, it felt personal. The scuffed granite, the cigarette burns on the grass, and the scratched graffiti were more than physical harm, they were an insult to the sacrifices the memorial represented. He pulled a rag from his jacket pocket and began cleaning the surface with care. As he wiped away the marks left behind, a quiet resolve settled over him. This wasn't the first time he had fought to defend something sacred, and it likely wouldn't be the last. A car pulled into the small parking lot nearby. Jack glanced up as a man in a sheriff's uniform stepped out, adjusting his hat. Sheriff Tate was a grizzled lawman, not unlike Jack, with lines on his face that told stories of long nights and tough decisions. "Heard about some trouble out here," the sheriff said, walking up to Jack. "Bikers again?" Jack nodded, his expression stoic. "Same group as before. They were looking to claim the place, but they won't be back." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? These types don't scare easy." "They're not scared of much," Jack admitted, "but they're smart enough to know when they picked the wrong fight." Tate studied Jack for a moment, then sighed. "Well, I'll keep an eye out for them. We'll patrol the area more often. In the meantime, why don't you let the town know what happened? Folks would want to help clean this up." Jack shook his head. "This is my fight. My duty. These names deserve respect, and I'll make sure they get it." The sheriff tipped his hat, recognizing the steel in Jack's voice. "All right. But don't hesitate to call if they come back. You're not alone in this, Jack." Despite Jack's insistence on handling things quietly, word of the confrontation spread through the small town. Sarah, the young reporter who had been watching from the shadows, couldn't stay silent. Her article appeared the next morning, with the headline, "War Memorial Defender Stands Tall Against Bikers." The piece painted Jack as a quiet hero, someone who not only protected a monument but also embodied the spirit of those it honored. It described his confrontation with the gang, his dedication to the memorial, and the sacrifices he had made during his years of service. Within hours, the community rallied. Veterans, local businesses, and even school groups came together, offering to restore the memorial and ensure its protection. Flowers and small American flags began to appear at the base of the wall, placed by those who wanted to honor the fallen. Jack, ever the reluctant hero, watched the activity from a distance. He appreciated the sentiment but struggled with the attention. This wasn't about him, after all it was about the names on the wall. Several days later, Sheriff Tate knocked on Jack's door. When Jack opened it, he found the sheriff holding a stack of folders and a smug grin. "Thought you'd like to know," Tate said, stepping inside. "We caught the bikers. Turns out they've been causing trouble all over the county. Vandalism, theft, you name it. But your little lesson made them sloppy. Left behind evidence we could use to tie them to their crimes." Jack nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Good. Let the courts deal with them." "Oh, they will," Tate assured him. "But I thought you might want to know one more thing." The sheriff handed Jack a folder. Inside were photos of the bikers in custody, along with a handwritten note from one of the younger members of the gang. It read, "I'm sorry for what we did. We didn't understand what that place meant. I'm trying to make it right." Jack stared at the note for a long moment. His initial reaction was skepticism, but then he remembered the fear and hesitation he'd seen in the young man's eyes that day. Maybe there was hope for him yet. The restoration of the memorial was completed within weeks, thanks to the outpouring of support from the town. A small ceremony was held to rededicate the site, with veterans and townspeople gathering to pay their respects. Jack stood at the edge of the crowd, his presence understated as always. When the speeches ended and the crowd began to disperse, a young boy approached Jack, tugging at his sleeve. "Are you the man who protected the wall?" the boy asked, his wide eyes full of admiration. Jack knelt down, his bad knee creaking. "It wasn't just me," he said gently. "It was everyone who cared enough to keep it safe. That includes you." The boy nodded solemnly, then placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the memorial. Jack watched him go, a rare smile breaking through his weathered features. As the sun set over the war memorial, Jack sat on a nearby bench, his cane resting against his leg. The names on the wall glowed softly in the fading light, each one a reminder of sacrifice, courage, and honor. Jack didn't seek recognition or glory. He didn't need it. His satisfaction came from knowing that he had kept his promise to his comrades, to himself, and to the generations who would visit this place long after he was gone. Justice had been served, not just in the legal sense, but in the restoration of respect and dignity to a sacred site. And for Jack, that was enough. With a final glance at the memorial, Jack rose and began his slow walk home, the sound of his cane tapping against the pavement echoing in the quiet night. Behind him, the wall stood tall, its name safe and its purpose fulfilled. Jack stood in the soft morning light, his face still as he gazed at the memorial. The sun's rays touched the silver of his medal, giving it a faint, almost invisible gleam. He didn't need the applause of others. He didn't want the recognition that so many people might have craved after such a confrontation. To him, it wasn't about being a hero or making a statement. It was about something much deeper, something that came from the soul. The memorial stood in front of him, unchanged in its strength and solemnity, a symbol of lives lived with purpose and sacrifice. The names etched in stone weren't just names, they were stories of courage, of valor, of brothers and sisters in arms who had given everything for the freedom others enjoyed. Jack had done what he could to protect that legacy. Not for the applause, but because it was the right thing to do. As he took in the scene one last time, his eyes briefly closed. A calmness washed over him. That feeling of peace wasn't something he found often, but it was there now. His mission had been completed, not with grand speeches or heroic acts, but with quiet, steady determination. A promise had been kept. Sometimes, Jack thought to himself, it's not the loudest people who make the biggest difference. He thought back to his time in the military. The countless battles, the men and women he had fought alongside, some of whom were now part of the long list of names on the wall. In the chaos of war, there was little room for recognition. It wasn't about who was noticed or who stood in the spotlight, it was about survival, about doing what had to be done so that others could go home. And after all those years, when he returned home, Jack found that the same quiet strength was what kept him going in the face of adversity. As a young man, he had believed that only the loudest, the boldest, the bravest would be remembered. But as time went on, Jack learned the truth: it wasn't the flashy gestures or the thunderous speeches that left a lasting impact. It was the moments when someone quietly stood their ground, when they made a stand not for their own glory but for something greater than themselves. It was in those small acts that true strength lived. The bikers, the ones who had tried to trample over the sacred ground, had believed their loud engines and brash attitudes made them the most powerful. They had thought that with force, they could intimidate anyone who stood in their way. but what they didn't realize was that Jack's quiet strength, built on years of discipline and experience, was far stronger than the force of their engines. What they failed to understand was that some things are not for sale, and some places are not for defiling. The memorial, the names, the memories, they were beyond their reach. And in the end, it was Jack who had defended them, not with the power of numbers or violence, but with the unwavering force of his resolve. Jack's limp, a constant reminder of his past struggles, never slowed his steps. He walked with a quiet purpose, steady as the morning breeze that seemed to carry the weight of the world on its invisible shoulders. Though the weight of his past experiences had left scars, both physical and emotional, they didn't define him. He had learned to carry them with grace, to walk with the knowledge that what mattered was how you lived, not what you had suffered. As Jack made his way down the path that led away from the memorial, he felt the presence of those names behind him, felt their quiet acknowledgement. They didn't need to say anything, they had been heard. And Jack, in his own way, had answered their call. The world may not always notice the quiet ones, the ones who don't seek attention or praise. They may not understand the depth of their actions or the strength it takes to stand firm when the odds are against them. But in the end, it was these individuals who made the world better, who shaped it in ways that no one else could. Jack had spent his life in service, not for the sake of glory, but because it was the right thing to do. And even now, as he walked away from the memorial, the burden of his past seemed lighter, the weight of duty and honor something he could carry without hesitation. He glanced over his shoulder one last time. The names, the sacrifices, and the memorial, all of it was safe. And that was all that mattered. A cool breeze swept through the trees, rustling the leaves and carrying the faintest whispers, almost as if the memorial itself were speaking. Jack could almost hear it, an echo of gratitude, of acknowledgement. It was a sound that couldn't be heard by anyone else, but he felt it in his heart. The people whose names were on the wall, they had found peace. And Jack had made sure that their peace remained undisturbed. With one final breath, Jack turned and began walking away, his footsteps steady and resolute. His limp was no longer a sign of weakness, but a testament to the battles he had fought and the life he had lived. And as he walked away from the place he had sworn to protect, Jack felt a sense of fulfillment that few could understand. He had done what he came to do. He had stood for something sacred, and he had made sure the world knew that some things were worth fighting for. In the quiet hum of the morning breeze, Jack knew that the legacy of the fallen was safe. He had carried out his duty, and in doing so, he had left behind a world just a little bit better than he had found it. And that, in the end, was enough. Sometimes, the quietest people in the room, the ones who don't seek praise, who don't need recognition, are the ones who carry the most strength. The world doesn't always see it, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. The reckoning for those who trample over what's sacred? It always comes. They may not know it at the time, but they never see it coming. And for Jack, that was more than enough.